We then thought we'd get two women who are involved in the labor movement, with the labor movement, and in the reproductive rights struggle to reflect on where we stand today in relation to these victories and what's being done today and what might be done. Stephanie Ross will follow Mary. Stephanie is one of the co-directors of the Global Labor Research Center at York University, really the founder of it. She teaches in social science, labor studies at York University. I'm proud to say she was a PhD student of mine and did the best study the Canadian Union of Public Employees ever written. I'm still looking forward to be published.
Tough acts to follow. And let me just start by saying thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel with these three women in particular, and to whom I think collectively we should be very grateful for taking the kind of leadership role that they have in the feminist movement. And also thanks to Leo for inviting me to be on this panel, although word to the wise, if you've not published your PhD dissertation yet, don't be on a panel with your supervisor. Just a little pro tip. I want to start off by talking a little bit personally, because when I saw this sort of title for this event, talking about the reflecting on the historic feminist victories of the 1980s, I had to think about what I was doing in the 1980s and what relationship I personally had with the struggles that have just been recounted. And I want to move from that to talk a little bit more about, in particular about pay equity and what I see as not only some of the really important ways that pay equity has transformed the lives of many women, but also some of the ways in which, beyond the challenges of implementation, some of the ways in which we've conceived pay equity that limits our ability to close the pay gap. So to start off on a personal vein, those of you who know me might recall that I'm from New Brunswick. I was a teenager in New Brunswick in the 1980s, during the time of these struggles that Carol and Mary have talked about. In that place, in that time, the feminist movement felt very far away. I'm not sure even where I was at the time. But I will say that growing up in New Brunswick made me a feminist. I grew up with many very strong women, some of whom led very unconventional lives, many of whom had to develop incredibly resilient survival strategies in that context, but I would say none of whom would have called themselves a feminist. And certainly I had no connection with the formal feminist movement until I left New Brunswick. But it certainly was the case that the lives that they lived, the lives that my contemporaries lived, made me a feminist. Many of you perhaps either have grown up in the Maritimes or in any small working class town could attest that these places are places of very strong community life, but that's both a blessing and a curse, especially for women. This was a place where in the 1950s the parish priest would come and visit to inquire after you've just had your 6th child why you weren't yet pregnant again with the 7th, which is something that did happen to my grandmother. This was a place where in the 1970s and 80s, divorce was a glaring anomaly, a recipe for social ostracism and economic disaster, even if you were being raped by your husband or your kids were being abused. This was a place where in the 1980s only girls who could afford it could make the trip to Montreal or to southern New Brunswick to get an abortion, because none of these were officially performed any longer at the Schiller Hospital from 1984 onwards in the community where I grew up. This was a place where in the 1980s girls who couldn't afford such travel had to have their babies, sometimes in secret, in a closet at home, as in one case, someone I went to high school with, always with great shame and gossip surrounding them. This was a place where I learned in very concrete ways that women's freedom and control over their bodies was directly and inextricably linked to their economic status, and where I decided that above all else, I would do whatever it took to be economically independent in my life, even though it meant probably, and it did, mean leaving New Brunswick forever. And something else about that experience, which I think, as I talk about it today, and think about the comments that the previous speakers have made, is how profoundly uneven the gains of the feminist movement have been in this country, and that is not merely a question of racialized minorities, although that is profoundly the case in our own community. It's not only a question of class, although that is also profoundly the case, but also of region. And I think that as a community, we can celebrate and should celebrate our victories, but I think we have to confront the real unfinished business of our movements. So it was because of these experiences in this place and that I became a particular kind of feminist, a socialist feminist, which I could only name in retrospect, but which in looking back was very clear in the choices I made and the politics that resonated with me. And when I arrived in Ontario in 1988 to attend university, the victories of the wins of the Ontario Pay Equity Act were fresh, as was the striking down of the abortion law. And those are two major feminist victories that largely made the life that I've had since possible. In fact, the first demonstration I ever attended was in 1989 in Ottawa, opposing the reintroduction of an abortion law. And that's also something I kind of forgot until preparing for tonight's talk. In some ways, I think for women of my generation, because these victories were fought by a previous generation and had been resoundingly achieved after much struggle, in some ways I think we had the impression that those matters were settled. And in 1989, as all of you know, a different kind of event punctured the consciousness of women of my generation, the Montreal Massacre, and I think that event and the politics that flowed from that became a central focus of our feminism subsequently. Of course, that's not the question of violence against women, and our place in institutions of higher learning is not unrelated to the struggle for pay equity and the struggle for reproductive freedom. But nonetheless, I think it shaped the way that we thought about these issues and how to fight on them in a particular way. I think probably those of us who were just entering into the workforce at that time, could have been forgiven for thinking that we had won pay equity. I mean, Ontario, along with Quebec, was the place of the most progressive pay equity legislation in the country. It uniquely covered both public and private sectors, as Mary mentioned. It was proactive rather than complaints-based, meant that you didn't have to go begging cap in hand to the employer, but rather that the employer had an obligation to develop, either unilaterally if there was no union, or in concert with the union through negotiations, to develop a plan to close the gender pay gap in a proactive way, as opposed to the situation at the federal level where unfortunately the pay equity legislation there remains complaints-based, and I think we can assess how difficult it's been for women, even in the unionized environments, to actually collect on the massive amounts of money that the government has saved on their backs. It was a statute that was available to all women regardless of their unionization status, although I'll say something about that in a minute. And again, as Mary said, there was a mechanism, again uniquely developed to make pay equity adjustments for women in workplaces where there was no male comparator, all of which were incredibly important innovations, particularly when you compare them to the rest of the country. Again, in most of the rest of the country, The private sector is not covered by pay equity legislation, and that remains the case today. The private sector is covered in the federal jurisdiction, but its weakness is, quite fatal in the other respect, in that you have to complain in order to get pay equity adjustments in that sector. And in most of the country, pay equity legislation is limited to the public sector, or even in the public service, even more narrowly construed. Now, for all that, perhaps if we look at the public sector, that's where the most major gains have been made in terms of pay equity. In universities, the workplaces that I've worked in since 1992, pay equity, whether through legislation or also in collective agreements, has radically reduced, if not eliminated, the gender pay gap. So, according to the Canadian Association for University Teachers, in 2011, female full professors earned an average of 95% of male full professors. And the pay gap gets smaller at the more junior levels, interestingly enough. So associate professors make 97% of their male counterparts, and assistant professors 98%. This is compared to a 75% pay gap in Ontario in that same year, and compared to 1986, when female academics in Canadian universities earned an average of 19% less than their male counterparts. So in the space of 30 years, in particular kinds of workplaces, the gender pay gap has been radically reduced, and I think that that is an important historic achievement that has to be acknowledged. But I think, it's worthwhile considering what kind of life I would have had I not become a university professor, and instead, as I told Leo one time, remained working as a cashier in a non-unionized grocery store instead, where I was working before I came to grad school. The conditions that make pay equity possible are distributed in radically uneven ways. The best litmus test that I have for this is when I talk to my female students in labor studies, when I tell them that in Ontario, private sector employers are supposed to have a proactive pay equity plan. And I assure you that this is absolutely news to them. That most of them, more often than not, are working in private sector, non-unionized workplaces, sometimes for very large firms, and they have no idea that their employers have an obligation to engage in a pay equity exercise. And upon further digging, often many of them find out that their employers aren't doing very well on that front either. Women in unionized workplaces have benefited the most from pay equity. They earn 84% of men's weekly wages, while those in non-unionized workplaces earn just 70%. There's ample research that documents the nature of these pay gaps, their persistence in the private sector, in non-unionized workplaces, and for particular categories of women, whether racialized or Indigenous women, and for women in working class rather than professional jobs. For me, it is more clear than ever, after nearly 20 years, or 30 years, that the legislation on its own isn't sufficient to deliver pay equity to the majority of women. At least one major intervention is required, and that is the mass unionization of women in the private sector. That it is clear to me, on reflection, that it is only possible to make the legislation real if workers have a form of collective counterpower to their employers, and who can organize their collective claims against the state if the state is also their employer. And that in the absence of unionization, pay equity is quite far out of most women's reach. But I think that the future of pay equity has to also go beyond our attempts to ensure that it's more widely and properly implemented, although that is certainly true and important. I think that it's worth thinking about the way that the processes of pay equity itself, the ways in which we assess the nature of the pay gap and how to remedy it, that I think have created unintended consequences that reinforce rather than take apart workplace inequalities. And I think that as feminists and as socialists, we need to confront those, and those are not, and this is not just about the technical process, rather it's about the social, political, and ideological assumptions that are embedded in that process. So I'll say two things that I want to put on the table in this respect. One, I think that that the process of evaluating jobs to determine whether or not they're being paid a fair wage relies on deeply gendered and racialized notions of skill and classist notions of skill. The job evaluation process, which is at the heart of pay equity, is an attempt to define objectively how jobs should be valued and compensated independent of the bias of a particular employer who is setting a wage rate. But that very process of valuing skill, of defining what skill is and assessing a value to be attached to it, is itself a political and ideological process. It involves assumptions about the relative value of different kinds of skills, whether they are male or female identified, or whether they are attached to other discriminated against groups, or whether they are attached to particular notions of class, professionalism, responsibility, autonomy, etc. That these notions of skill actually are expressions of power relations, of the capacity of different groups of workers to collectively define their jobs as higher skill. And that capacity to collectively assert jobs as higher skilled is very uneven, right? That groups have, particular groups of workers, whether it's craft workers or doctors, have collectively organized in various ways to assert that their skill is valuable. But in that context, creating and reproducing, playing on notions of what skills are hard-earned, right, that come through education, that come through a process of learning that is valued and credentialed, versus skills that are considered natural and therefore, and not learned, right, attached to natural characteristics of individuals or because one is part of a particular group, and therefore not valued. And in the process of doing pay equity, you know, that often the kinds of jobs that women end up being in tend to score low on these assessments because the low status that is attached to the kinds of skills that are inherent in, or that are involved in women's jobs. And so I think that another front of the pay equity struggle has to be a contestation over the way we define skill and how we value it. I'll push this to another level, which is to say that in many ways the pay equity process leaves the hierarchy of skills untouched. The idea that there are some kinds of jobs that should be paid more, and that the problem is that different people doing that same job are paid unequally. Well, that's certainly an injustice. It is also an injustice to say that those people who are doing socially valued but low status jobs should be objectively determined to belong at the bottom of the skill, occupational, and therefore wage hierarchy. And that we can know, that we can see very clearly that those occupational hierarchies are also defined and characterized by class inequality and racial inequality. So in that respect, despite the fact that for myself personally, and for many, many hundreds of thousands of women in this country, the pay equity victories that we have been able to achieve have transformed our lives, our possibilities, have transformed the conditions in which we make choices, as Carolyn very rightly pointed out. I think we have hit up against a wall in terms of how far we can challenge the nature of the capitalist division of labor in our workplaces. Let me put it that way. And that if we are to deal with the fact that some workers and some jobs are routinely devalued, we have to develop different kinds of equity strategies. One which has been advocated by Rosemary Horskett, who many of you know, and which I think needs to be put back on the table, are solidaristic wage strategies. Strategies that take as their goal not the analysis of which jobs deserve which amounts of money, but the compression of the gap between the lowest and the highest paid workers in any given workplace. The idea that the lowest paid workers in any given workplace, their wages should be the political and strategic priority to be raised, regardless of the content of the skills content of their jobs. It's an assertion that those jobs have social value beyond their technical skills content. And that strategy also is not just a gender pay equity strategy, but also would challenge other forms of inequality in our workplace hierarchies. Now, of course, just like the forms of pay equity that we have won, there's no doubt that that would require an enormous amount of political struggle within unions as organizations, within workplaces, etc. It means that the highest paid workers need to make a political and solidaristic commitment to those who are at the bottom of the wage hierarchy. And that is absolutely no simple matter. I say as a university professor, I talked to some of those people. Anyway, but that said, I think it is an imperative for those workers who understand that simply reproducing and moving around who gets to be where in a particular job hierarchy does not meet the test of social justice. That those amongst us have a responsibility to fight for solidaristic wage strategies that bring the bottom up as precisely as a way to deliver on the promise that pay equity struggles made to us in the 1980s. Thank you.